we've all, I think, come through various stages about Christmas, and I was just thinking of my own, and I remember the great theological question I had one year spilled over into the next months as I looked behind the settee, we called it, the sofa, because I was sure that my fire engine was somewhere there that they had forgotten to deliver. And I never did find it, and it really has bothered me since. But that, I think that for most of us, was where we started. Christmas was Santa Claus and the great presents, and the apple at the bottom of the stocking and all that. And it tied up a bit with the baby Jesus, and we kind of liked that idea, the little child in the stable and all the donkeys there, and it caught your imagination. And I think we all started there with Jesus and the birth. And then as years go on, you begin to catch the idea that this was just a myth, it was just a fairy story and wasn't real at all. And I certainly came through that, and came through a period when I thought the Bible was obviously a good book, but I didn't think that everything in it was necessarily true. And I rose to, you remember the singer, the black singer, who sang, "It ain't necessarily so," Calloway. And I thought that's true. And I struggled with that through the years when I had to do Latin, and really what I did was Latin at grammar school and then Greek later on at university, but struggled through the years when I got to know the Latin authors and the men who wrote around the first century, and wondered really in a way why they didn't talk more about Jesus if he did really live, and began to have difficulties with whether the history was true or not. Then I came to London and walked one day, between those two glass cases in the British Museum, and on one side, was the Codex Alexandrinus, and the other side was the Codex Sinaiticus, and one was the 3rd century AD, and the other was the 4th century AD, and they had the whole New Testament in them, and that made me start to think, because I realized that if that actual manuscript was written in the 3rd century, and Jesus lived supposedly in the 1st century, then there was only a century or so between. And this meant that this Jesus story must be real and must be historical. And that was the beginning for me of beginning to see that perhaps there was more in this than just a children's story. And of course it was after that I got to know some of the facts, of the manuscripts that lay behind the history of the New Testament. And I knew the importance of it because in university we had studied Plato's Republic in philosophy class, and I was amazed that we all regarded that as absolutely the book that Plato had written, and yet it was written in 200 BC, and the earliest manuscript that we had of it was 900 AD. And so there were 1100 years in between. And yet we all accepted that as the basis, and all philosophy departments accept that as the basis of classical philosophy. So I began to see that the ancient books didn't have even the kind of manuscript documentation behind them that this story of the New Testament had. And then I remember when I read about the Chester Beatty Papyrus, and old Chester Beatty was an American oil man who started a museum actually in Ireland, in Dublin, And in it he gathered all kinds of ancient manuscripts, Muslim and Christian and other religions. And he had there what we came to call the Chester Beatty Papyrus. And it was just a little bit of a manuscript of the New Testament. And it had part of John in it. And it was dated 125 AD and as early as 100 AD. And I knew that John's Gospel, John was on the island of Patmos, and he died actually around 100. And so John's Gospel was written close to 100, and this manuscript, this actual physical manuscript, was about 100 to 125 AD. So that startled me. Why? Because I had a dear grandmother who was a Salvation Army officer. And she was a Salvation Army officer in Larne and in Belfast in Northern Ireland. She was my dad's mother. And she was born in 1860. And she died in 1945, really the same year as the war. She died. And I, of course, was 11 years of age at that time and had often talked to her. And I realized that she must have been conscious of things at least 10 years of age. So she must have known what was happening in 1870. And here I was talking to her in 1945. And I realized that therefore, in a way, I had a direct connection with things that happened 75 years ago. But then I realized now that I've lived another 50 years from that. And so 125 years ago, I have some personal knowledge in the sense of a personal relationship with what happened then. Well, of course, that just settled it for me. You know, if any of us can go back 125 years, then that meant that 125 years after Jesus' death in 30 was 155, and that means anybody living in 155 AD had talked to friends or eyewitnesses or relatives who had seen him die. So it did change it. I mean, it did change Christmas for me. It made it no longer a myth, no longer just a nice story. It didn't matter how many imaginary movies they produced of it. I was settled in my mind. Jesus was a historical person, and Jesus really did do and say these things. And of course, it came home to me as true because these people who told the story did not get rich. In fact, many of them died with their children in lion arenas and on crucifixion hills. And so I saw that you wouldn't die for what you knew to be a lie. You might die for what you thought was true, but you'd never die for what you knew to be a lie. And if they had known he hadn't risen from the dead, then they wouldn't have died for that. And I suppose that's what changed even Jesus for me, because I was prepared then to believe. And we were brought up, we were brought up in school, not only in Sunday school, but in ordinary state school. I know in America, you don't think of the state school as being very religious, but in a state elementary school, that was where I learned Jesus, friend of little children. Miss McNeely used to sit at her, she had a little organ, and she was just paid by the government. She wasn't a Christian or at least wasn't thought of as a Christian, and she used to play that and teach us Jesus, friend of little children. So we knew that there, so we knew of Jesus, as an example that we ought to follow. And we all believed in that, whether he was a myth or not. So he was always a very good man in my mind. And of course, more and more as I read people like Stuart Mills, the philosopher, who said there is no character as perfect, no human character as perfect as Jesus of Nazareth. And so we believed all that. But that was as far as it went until I began to realize that he had risen from the dead, that he wasn't like Muhammad, he wasn't like Buddha. And they didn't ever claim to be Scott's son. They didn't ever claim to rise from the dead. This man beat death, he came back to live again after he was dead. And I read that book. You remember Morrison wrote it, Who Moved the Stone? And you remember it, he says there are two facts that proved Jesus' resurrection from the dead, the empty tomb and the appearances, you know. And he's very good on the empty tomb, and it made sense to me. He said, people say the Romans stole the body. Well, why didn't they parade through the streets and say this is a myth, you know? Well, they didn't. And the disciples stole the body. Well, would they then take their children by their hand into lion arenas and die for what they knew was just a bluff lie that they created? And it's the same with the empty tomb, you know, all the argument about the hallucinations. These were down-to-earth fishermen. They didn't see hallucinations. So it did change that for me. It was no longer just Jesus, kind of a good human being that I ought to try to be like, but this man was actually the Son of the Maker of the universe. And that's the way it was for me until we moved to England. I think that was it. Until we probably, until we moved here, until we closed the church in Minneapolis and moved here, which must have been 1970 probably, 1977 was it? 1987. 80, yeah, about 85 anyway. I think 87 we closed the church, and the concentration was here, and then that was startling to me. You know, I'll show you the verse. It's Colossians chapter 1. It's Colossians 1, and it just changed everything. Colossians 1, and it's page 1026 in that black RSV, 1026, and it's Colossians 1 and verse 15. It's at the bottom of the left-hand column there. Colossians 1 and verse 15, page 1026. And it's Paul, you know, writing to the people in Colossae. And Colossians 1 and 15, he, that is Jesus, you know, he's talking about, he is the image of the invisible God. And that I kind of caught. The next one was baffling. The firstborn of all creation. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created. And I mean, I could not believe it. For in him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And then this verse, I had never seen it before. Colossians 1 and 17. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And I thought, that's crazy. How could a man born in, say, 4 or 5 BC, how could he be before all things? And how in him could all things hold together? And that was just overwhelming to me, that Jesus of Nazareth was the only Son of our Maker, and that he was actually in existence before he was born here on this earth. And that had to be what this meant, you know. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And then the other one, in him all things were created. And it did tie up for me with some verses that I did know. You remember the beginning of John's Gospel is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and it's meant to be Jesus, you know, he's the Word. In him all things were created, and without him was not anything made that was made. And I remembered that verse, but I'd never been able to make any sense of it. And never for a minute did I think I was made in Jesus. Never for a minute. I thought, how could I be made in Jesus if he only lived in 4 BC in the 1st century? And then I began to see that Jesus had said some remarkable things, you know. He did say, you remember in one prayer, he prayed to God and he said, Father, restore to me the glory that I had with you before the world was made. Restore to me the glory that I had with you before the world was made. And that's when I started. I mean, I'm sure, I mean, I've told you this before, but I'm sure some of you might have just taken it for granted. Sure, he was pre-existent. You know, that's what the theology says. Sure, he was pre-existent. Sure, he had a pre-existent life before he came to earth. I never got that. I was probably stupid or something, but I never got hold of that. I either never heard of it, or if I ever heard of it, I didn't take it seriously. But now I began to see this wasn't just a man that was born here on this earth. This was actually God's own Son, who lived with him before the world was. And it made sense of that. He's the firstborn of all creation. I saw, oh, Jesus was begotten from his Father, and then in Jesus, God made all of us. Inside Jesus. I had no trouble with that. I mean, you may say, oh, well, wait a minute, did he insert himself in? I had no trouble with that because I knew the world above, there's a world outside this that is a spiritual world. And even with our radio waves, we know there are many invisible things that are real. So I didn't have difficulty with the idea of God making us inside his Son, because we believe there are no bodies there, you know, or there are spiritual bodies, but they're not like physical bodies. So I didn't have difficulty with the idea God can make, but that he did actually make us inside his Son. That, I couldn't believe that he made Hitler inside Jesus. And it was only then, really, when I mean, I suppose you have to see it in other people. I saw it in Hitler. I saw, you mean God made Hitler inside Jesus, and Jesus actually had to bear that? Then I saw, you mean he actually had to bear me inside? You mean Jesus has all these years been bearing me? That's, I don't know what you all made, you know, of bearing sins, but that made sense to me. Oh, he bore my sin. He bore all my independence inside himself. And that made sense to me, that God really is a dear Father. I knew it because I knew my dad and what he suffered with my brother. I'm sure he suffered a lot with me. You always say it in your brother. But my brother was a disappointment to my dad, who was just an electrician, you know, foreman electrician in the shipyard. And my brother served his apprenticeship there and wouldn't go to work, wouldn't go to work. So, of course, it was a dreadful, you know, dishonor to my father. And I saw the pain in my father's eyes. So I began to get a little glimpse of what our dear Father bears when he bears us inside his own Son, you know. And that changed it all for me. It really, in a way, Einstein helped me. I'm reading that biography of Einstein, you know, by Isaacson. And it helped me when I saw that in 1905, Einstein did one of his thought experiments, you remember, and that was for him the glorious year. He discovered the special theory of relativity. And it was then that he played the idea, you know, with a train, with a person in the train and a person on the embankment and a lightning strike. And he saw that the lightning strike appeared to both the man on the train and a man further away, that it was at the same time, but they actually saw it a millisecond later. And he said then, he posited his special theory of relativity, that time was not the same in all places. That if you, in fact, he put a clock on the top of an 8-story building and proved that it went slower than the clock on the floor. And then it became ordinary knowledge to us in our space flights, you know, that if you went out far enough, you'd actually come back younger. You'd come back younger than everybody on Earth, because time and space are relative. And of course it made sense of this whole thing. 1,000 years in your court are as a day. I saw that it is possible. It's possible for Christ to be born before the creation, and yet to be in a situation where it is all one great moment for him. And the little illustration you remember that I've told you about, I read about in America. There was a procession in the town, you know, going by, and there were two little brothers, and one little brother was so small that he couldn't get up on the back of the garden shed, on the roof of the garden shed, so he stood at the fence and he looked through a little hole, and he could just see the piece of the procession that passed by him. But his brother had climbed up onto the roof of the garden shed. And of course he could look over the fence, and he was able to see not only what was passing, but what was coming and what had passed. And that made sense, you know, that God's eternity contains time, and therefore God is able to see the whole thing as one great second. And it made sense to me of all the talk about Jesus bore our sins. You know, how could he bear a sin that I hadn't committed yet? And now I began to see, you have been made in Jesus, and he is able to sense everything in one great moment. It made sense to me actually about those who had died. I said to Irene one time in a certain experience, I said, you know, a millisecond after I die, you will be beside me. And I think it's with our dads and mums. A millisecond after because time for them goes short. And for us it's years and years, but for them it's a millisecond. And so we're right there together. And so it all made sense, you know. Of course well, you know, without me saying it, to me it's made it very personal, you know, for Jesus, because I'm aware that I act either like a poison inside him, or as vermin eating away at his heart, you know, or I am a part of his body that gives him delight. You know, it ties up, I don't know if Deborah knows the story, you know, of Chariots of Fire, but it makes sense of Eric Little, you remember, who won the 100 yards in the Olympics, and he said, I feel the pleasure of God when I run, you know. And it seems to me that makes sense, that God has pleasure actually in us, or he has pain in us, depending on whether we're living really inside him and whether we're really dealing with him in that way, or whether we're just pretending we're our own little people. It was a bit difficult for me because we were brought up in I would have called it a pretty close little Belfast family, you know, father, mother, Desmond, my brother, and I. We were 2 years difference in age. And my mother, for various reasons, always encouraged us to feel that your own family cares about you, you know. So really, that's the unit, and that's what you must protect at all costs. So I was very conscious, this is my father and this is my mother, and I'm close to them and closer to them than I'll be ever to anybody else. So it was quite a little step to see that actually they were just dear expressions of my own father. They were just dear temporary expressions of my own father. Really, they were just God's method of getting me here to earth, getting me alive. But that I was actually made inside his own dear son, and I was part of him. And I think that's the great thing. And I think that's the heart of Christmas, you know, that each of us were actually made inside Jesus. And with all our church stuff and all our Muslim and all our Christianity stuff, really it's all beside the point. He has made each one of us inside his dear Son. And we are close to them and dear to their hearts and part of them. And really we can give them delight and we can enjoy them. Or we can pretend we're on our own, you know, exiles who live away out on our own in space. So Christmas is really something warm for us. Let us pray.